This little corner is where we keep those supplies.
Tucked in the basement of Rosehaven, this Northwest Portland Women's Day shelter, Katie O'Brien and team store supplies for those living on the streets.
There's plenty of tarps right here. Those are more cost effective for us. There's only a couple of sleeping bags and we're completely out of tents right now.
Typically, Rosehaven gets tents and tarps from Multnomah County monthly.
I think about 15% of our tents come from the county, so it's just a handful of them, but it's nice to get.
Last week, Multnomah County Chair Jessica Vega Peterson announced that starting May 27th, Multnomah County will no longer supply service providers like Rosehaven with tents and tarps, except during severe weather.
To offer tents and tarps only in inclement weather seems kind of like the reverse of what we should be doing here.
The chair's goal is to have enough shelter and housing so tents aren't needed.
Well, the shelter is not available right now, and so this decision seems premature. We need these tents year-round, and it's not going to stop our agency from continuing to buy tents and tarps for people who need this.
Without county contribution, Rosehaven will spend an additional $500 a month to keep up supply, which they're allowed to do under this policy change.
So this new ordinance by the county is meaningless.
Todd Littlefield sits on the Lentz Neighborhood Livability Association, a Southeast Portland neighborhood often faced with the side effects of homelessness.
I think something needs to be codified that the nonprofits will not be funded if they hand out tents and tarps. And until that is codified, then I don't know if there will be a change.
Records shared with KGW show between January and March of this year, Multnomah County gave 10,030 tarps and 1,891 tents to service providers to then give to people.
I'm a survivor.
Like Ronnie.
I can't freaking count. Countless. I can't count. At least 100 people out here dying every day, and a tarp or a tent is enough to save somebody's life.
Well, it's clearly not life-saving when you've got people dying outside my house.
Records show so far this year, Multnomah County gave 20 tarps and 5 tents to Rapid Response, the group the city of Portland hires for $16 million a year to remove those supplies, which has happened to Richard many times throughout his 30 years on Portland streets.
It's real frustrating, you know, especially like the Rapid Response thing. They come in, they get your supposed to hold on to it for 30 days. You go down there and it's never there. They just throw it in the garbage.
Do you think not getting a tent would force you to go into shelter?
No, because there's not enough shelters.
Ronnie says there's more to it than that.
That's not necessarily true, man. Sometimes them shelters don't want to take people. A lot of things happen. Sometimes you got to get on a list and you got to get, you have to get an approval or you have to get a referral. You got to jump through all these hoops.
So if you don't get a tent, would it force you to go inside?
No, if we don't get a tent, man, we're going to start making tents.
Until they get rid of unsanctioned camping in Portland and codify no more tents and tarps in Portland, nothing will change. Don't we want change?
Well, joining me now live in studio is Multnomah County Chair Jessica Vega Peterson. Chair Vega Peterson, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much, Blair.
Okay, so we just watched that story. What do you make of the polarization of this issue? There is very clear, distinct sides. How do you walk that line?
Yeah, I mean, that was a really good example of the very different views that folks have. For me, I think all of us can agree on is that tents are not a solution to homelessness. Tents and tarps are not something that is really going to bring people safe and stable inside. It's not a solution to unsheltered homelessness. What it is something that is helping to helping somebody in a really unfortunate situation because the rest of the system hasn't been built up enough to really serve what they need. So what we're trying to do here is to really focus our resources, really focus all of our energies on building out that system that is going to bring someone in from the street into a shelter, into their own home, really giving them the supports that they need in the long term.
So I'm so curious, I've covered this for quite some time now. Why the change in policy now?
Yeah, well, you know, the reality is that there wasn't actually an administrative rule or any kind of policy previously saying when or how tents and tarps should be should be handed out. It was something, honestly, pre-COVID that the county didn't. If you look at the historical data, the county wasn't handing out tents and tarps in any significant numbers. What happened is that there was a group of providers who wanted to have some cost savings by having the county buy in bulk for the tents and tarps that they were already purchasing. And so that was something that started. During COVID, when we had to reduce the capacity of our shelters, the county did end up setting up a supply center and handing out much more tents and tarps. But I think I wanted to be very intentional. I wanted to be very thoughtful about having a policy that represented like the direction that we wanted to go. And I think the direction that we want to go is to be focusing on building out our shelter capacity, building out the connections to permanent housing. We are still going to be sending passing out hygiene kits, first aid kits, emergency clothing, emergency sleeping, like tents and sleeping bag, or I'm sorry, not tents, sleeping bags, those kinds of things as part of what we're going to be distributing to folks who want to do outreach themselves. But we are not going to be handing out tents anymore.
I'm curious though, because in the past you have stood firmly behind this belief that tents and tarps are life-saving. What changed? Yeah, so instead of having them passed out at our supply centers every single day of the year, this policy really focuses on making sure that we are providing tents when it is a life-saving matter. So when there is declared severe weather emergency, when there is a cold weather activation, we will be passing those out to our providers. We will be distributing them as we're closing down our shelters and people are going out back into the cold, because it can be, especially when we don't have enough shelter beds, it can be a life-saving device. So I wanted to make sure that we were following the best practices when it comes to that. It's just not something that the county is going to be in the business of doing on a day-to-day basis.
So what I'm hearing from you is that you want to focus more resources on building more shelter and affordable housing, but when this new policy kicks in at the end of this month, there won't be enough shelter or affordable housing. And even when we do have those beds, like say those 200 temporary beds that opened in Old Town in the middle of winter, arguably the time you would expect people to go inside. I remember you even saying on some news conferences that they had empty and available beds in the dead of winter. So how does the county handle people who refuse to go into shelter?
Yeah, I think we have to continue to do the work with outreach workers, anyone who's coming in contact, of really encouraging people to come inside. What we do know is that the outreach supplies that we have and the folks who are working with people every day in outreach, like they use some of these things like water, like hygiene kits, to make those connections. And so we want to really be encouraging people to come in and to use the capacity that we're building in shelters to get connected to somebody who can be their caseworker as they get into housing. We can do that by making sure that people know that it's available, by continuing to make sure that the outreach we're doing is very effective. One of the projects I have our new COO working on at the county is actually looking at the outreach that's happening and making sure we're being as effective as possible all throughout the county, so that people are getting those important connections, they are being encouraged to come inside, and that we're building the capacity to do that.
Let's talk a little bit more about that though, that trust building between a provider and a homeless person, arguably one of the most important pieces of outreach work. So your office says that outreach providers distribute supplies to build trust. And I know your policy has changed, but if part of giving supplies is to build trust, to get someone to go inside, why would you give a tent, which is sort of an off-ramp to that end goal?
Yeah, so I think that's why we really want to focus on those things that can help build connections, something that somebody might need right in that moment. Maybe it's a pair of socks, maybe it's some water, maybe it's some food, those kinds of supplies. But to have that conversation to help somebody make the decision to come inside. We also know though, like as some folks on the video were saying, is that we don't have enough shelter right this second. And so what we want to do is, for those providers that are still getting tents or handing out tents and tarps, like until we have enough available shelters, that's still going to be an okay use for any of the flexible dollars that they have for the county. But ultimately, I would love for Portland and Multnomah County to have a policy like we see in Washington, D.C., where they don't hand out any kind of tents and tarps at all, because they have the shelter capacity that they need, and because they want to really encourage people to go inside. And that's what we want.
That would be the goal.
To come inside.
Yeah, but we have quite a long ways to go. So let's talk about that provider funding. Your office says providers will retain the ability to use their flexible client funding to obtain and distribute tents on their own. What is that funding? Is that taxpayer money?
Yeah, those are dollars that are part of some of the flexible dollars that we provide to providers to do things like outreach, to do things like housing navigation as they're meeting folks on the street to help get them connected. Maybe it's the ID that they need. Maybe it's help with getting some Social Security. Those kinds of work that's happening every day on the street. But they will also be able to use those flexible dollars just the same way that they have been for a long time in getting the supplies that they think. I think that the folks who are out there talking to people who are living unsheltered, who are doing that work, they know best about how to build those relationships and what people need. And so we want to provide them the flexibility and really, respect the expertise that they have to do that. But the policy says that they'll be able to use those funds in a flexible manner as long as we don't have capacity within our shelters.
So if providers can buy their own tents, is there any teeth to this policy change? Will we see a change in the number of tents on our streets?
I hope so, right? And I hope, again, we have about 3,200 beds approximately every night that's open 365 days a year for people to come into shelter. That's an 81% increase than the number of shelter beds that we had in 2020. So we are continuing to build capacity and create spaces for people to come inside and be safe off the streets. So we want to continue to build on that. But I think that it's important that the county is no longer doing that on a regular basis, except in those severe weather conditions. I think that's a really important thing because we need to focus our resources and our energy on really making sure we have that capacity to build those longer lasting, more stable places for people to go.
Was there a push from the city to make this policy change?
The mayor has made, no secret of his desire to no longer have any government entities handing out tents and tarps. So I appreciated that, and he's been an advocate for that. For me, this wasn't so much about the city at all as really taking the time to make a decision that made sense with the direction of the work that we wanted to do in building our homeless response system for all of Multnomah County, and making sure that we were still providing that life-saving supplies when it was needed.
We are hearing from Mayor Keith Wilson tonight. He says the city of Portland welcomes Multnomah County's decision to limit the distribution of tents and tarps, a practice that he says perpetuates unsheltered homelessness. County-funded homelessness service providers now have an opportunity to revisit their policies on tent and tarp distribution. We ask that they consider the poor health outcomes, fire risks, street and sidewalk accessibility issues of those experiencing physical disabilities, and the high cost of removing contaminated tents before continuing this practice. So do you think service providers will change their policies? Will you be pushing for them to reevaluate when and how they hand out tents and tarps?
What I want to focus on is making sure that we have policies that make sense to the reality on our streets. So I think that if we can help encourage providers to bring people inside, to direct them to the right shelter for them, I think that is where I want to be focused. I think that one of the things that is true is that sometimes it takes a little while for someone to be ready to come inside. Mm-hmm. And again, like the people who are doing that outreach are the experts in building those relationships and understanding. So this gives some flexibility, I think, to them to make that decision. But ultimately, I think we are all benefiting when people are inside and not sleeping outside, that they have those safe, stable places to go. And I think we all should be working to make that happen.
So will the service providers will there be any accountability for the service providers that are still paying for tents and tarps and handing them out as often as they want?
Yeah, if service providers are using their own dollars, if that is part of their service model, that's really their decision. That was true before the county started doing that, right? This was a practice. What the difference is that we weren't seeing it in the numbers that we did over the last several years. And so to that end, I think we will see a difference in the number of tents that we see outside. And again, the hope is that we are encouraging people to come inside while still recognizing that for everyone that isn't quite an option yet.
Might be a hard question, but do you have an estimated timeline for how soon we could see enough shelter beds for the number of people on our streets, which continues to grow? Yeah,
I think that's a really good question. I think it's not just about the number of beds, which is important. As, like I said, we have about 3,200 now. The mayor is also opening new shelter beds too, right? So we're having more open all the time. But I think for me, the important thing is that we're building that system of care for people so that it's not just about having a shelter bed for everyone who is unsheltered homelessness, experiencing unsheltered homelessness right now, but having that flow through so that if you're coming into a shelter, you're not staying there for months and years at a time, but we have the resources to get you, the services you need, the rental assistance you need, a place to go so that you're moving from shelter into a more permanent, stable situation. Maybe that is a treatment program, and then maybe that's recovery housing for somebody. So really creating that system. So it's not just about the number of beds. I want to be really clear about that. That's important, and we are investing in it. But it's also about having the resources to take somebody through a shelter into a more permanent, stable situation. That way, we're going to be able to bring more and more people off the street as we're getting people housed, which is ultimately the goal.
In a homelessness steering committee meeting this month with city and county leaders, our takeaway was that the regional homelessness response action plan has been plagued by a lack of objectives, with members saying, quote, there's a lack of concrete goals, timelines, and measurable results. So what is the goal of the homelessness response action plan?
Yeah, so that is a really good question. And I also want to say in that meeting, I think that there's a lot of new folks who are on the council who are sitting in those meetings. The Homelessness Response Action Plan was built over 18 months of good negotiation between the city and the county to reestablish our IGA and to continue that work for the next 3 years. We have a lot of shared goals in our Homelessness Response Action Plan, which include getting 50% of the people who were unsheltered in January of 2024, creating the beds and the capacity to have those folks come inside. It's about reducing the disparities that we're seeing in certain populations who are experiencing homelessness, including our Black and African American population. So really addressing disparities that we're seeing over representation of people who are experiencing homelessness. So that is a goal that we have. And we also want to make sure that we are looking at the factors that lead to people who are becoming homeless in the first place, so what we call inflow, and reducing the folks who are leaving jails, who are leaving prisons and going right into homelessness, people who are leaving emergency departments or treatments and going directly into homelessness. So those are all part of the goals that we have for the Homelessness Response Action Plan. What I'm excited about is we have new people on the Board of Commissioners, we have new people in City Council. We are continuing this conversation, having active conversations about what are the things that we want to look at as far as our goals as we move forward. We have this new data dashboard that our Homeless Services Department has built that's giving us a lot more information about inflows and outflows. And that also is going to be a huge tool for us as we take a look at ultimately what we want to see happen. I think the North Star for everyone, though, is to reduce the number of people who are experiencing homelessness in Multnomah County.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time tonight.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming on the show. Multnomah County Chair Jessica Vega Peterson. Well, now, everyone, we want to hear from you. It's your turn to weigh in. What is going through your mind, especially when it comes to the new tent and tarp rule? Email us at thestory@kgw.com or call and leave a voicemail, 503-226-5090.